Welcome everybody to Writers at the Reef, where art meets science, hosted by the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies and the Australian Institute of Marine Science. I'm John Chandler and I'm the Secretary for the Foundation, and very happy to welcome you here tonight, as well as all those virtually online on Zoom. Thank you very much for coming along. Unfortunately, our host tonight, Paul, is unavailable, so I'm taking over the role of emceeing. So the acknowledgement of the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first inhabitants of the country pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we stand today, which is the Bindal and Walgarukaba people. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we also like to acknowledge the valuable contribution that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make to James Cook University and the broader community. Now, as I said, Paul was unable to attend tonight. Paul is currently the CEO of the Australian Institute of Marine Science and was part of the brainchild for this Writers in Residency. He spent over 30 years working all over the world as an environmental engineer. His love of literature goes back to his earliest days, fueled by parents who loved to read and travel. He wrote his first story at 5 on his dad's typewriter and is now the author of 5 novels, including The Abrupt Physics of Dying, and which was shortlisted for the CWA New Blood Dagger Award. His latest novel, Turbulent Wake, was named by several UK book sites as their book of the year for 2019. His 6th novel, In My Time of Anarchy, is due out in 2023. Paul lives in Townsville with his wife, Heidi. So this intersection is obviously very important to him between the arts and science, and it's very important because Paul will talk about this. It's a very important anniversary. So we'll have a short word from Paul.
Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Hardesty. I'm the CEO of the Australian Institute of Marine Science, which is Australia's national marine science agency. I'm also the chairman of the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies at James Cook University here today, where you're all meeting. And I just wanted to welcome you all to today's event, where we're going to be talking to the 6 writers who were chosen amongst a group of over 70 who applied for the Writers' Residency being held at Ames over the course of this last week to celebrate, in part, our 50th anniversary. We're really glad that the writers could come. I hope that they've had a great time meeting with our scientists, touring our facilities, talking to traditional owners that we work with closely, and just generally getting an appreciation for what we do in the scientific community. And it's really all about this combination, this melding of art and science, which we think is so important to communicate what's actually going on in the reef, not only the Great Barrier Reef, but the world's reefs being affected by climate change and so many other stresses. So I hope you have a great time. Sorry I couldn't be with you. Take care.
Thanks, Paul. Now, FELS, the Foundation for Australian Literary Studies, was started in 1966 by Professor Colin Roderick with the aim to foster the study and appreciation of Australian literature. So we're coming up to our 50 years of operation. The foundation is funded through the generosity of the late Professor Colin Roderick and his wife, Mrs. Margaret Roderick, as well as donations by members and the general public. We can only do what we do because of that generosity. A writer, editor, scholar and educator, Colin Roderick worked for a publishing house of Angus and Robertson from the late 40s to the 60s, taking up a position of foundation professor of English literature at James Cook University in 1965. Colin is best remembered for promoting the study of Australian literature at the time when it was attracted little academic interest, and we can't forget that this is something that's not granted to all universities. During his long career, Colin Roderick wrote more than 50 books, authored 127 articles on the history of Australian literature. Throughout this time at James Cook University, he continued to produce scholarship on the work of such figures as Henry Lawson, Rosa Parede, Miles Franklin, and Banjo Paterson. His legacy is his public-facing work for raising the profile of Australian literature in the public sphere. He was instrumental in setting up the Miles Franklin Award, and the Colin Roderick Award was a version of that, but perhaps even more general and expansive in ways that reflect his vision, which was about supporting all kinds of Australian writers of all classes and types by connecting them with reading public. In 2000, Colin Roderick died at 89 years of age. And in 2020, Margaret Roderick passed away at the age of 98. We'd like to remember them, and we thank them very much for their legacy. So tonight is about writers in residency. I'm going to hand over to Victoria. I'll just give you a little bit of background with Victoria Cutthainen. She's Associate Professor of English and Writing at JCU. Born in UK, raised in Canada, educated in Canada and Australia. She has been visiting scholar at the Menzies Centre for Australian Studies in London, Strathclyde University in Scotland, and is Fellow of the Queensland Academy. Trained in post-colonial literary studies, she is an author of 2 monographs and many articles. She serves as the co-editor of JSOL, Journal of the Association for the Study of Australian Literature, as well as the chair for ACHRC, which is Humanities in Regions portfolio. Recipient of 2 competitive international writing residencies, Victoria is currently completing her first long-form creative manuscript. So I'm going to leave it with Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you, everyone who's here with us in person, who's lent us your Thursday afternoon. Thank you, everyone who's joining us online as well. I know there are a lot of people zooming in because it's a hybrid event. And thank you to our friends and colleagues for joining us from Cairns. Thank you. Very special thank you to Linda and to Marge, as well as to Bethany, who've helped to make all of this happen tonight and all week. I'm really excited to introduce to you some people that it's been a huge joy, a highlight of my career actually, to spend time with this week. I'd like to do a very Canadian thing and apologize in advance for the fatigue you can hear in my voice. We've had a very, very packed schedule, as I'm sure you will hear a little bit about tonight, but we're all, I don't know about me, but I don't want to speak for the others, but I'm struggling to string words together tonight. So I've got my phone here to cue me. First of all, I'm just going to introduce to you this wonderful panel, and then the idea is we'll have about 50 minutes of a panel discussion and open it up to a Q&A. So sitting directly across from me, this is Jess White. Jessica White is an award-winning author of the novels A Curious Intimacy and Entitlement, and a hybrid memoir, which I highly recommend, about deafness called Hearing Maud. Jessica has received funding from Arts Queensland and the Australia Council for the Arts, and she's undertaken residencies in Australia, Italy, and Germany. Jess is currently a senior lecturer in creative writing and literature at the University of South Australia. And on the residency, Jess was working on her novel about climate change, Sea Creatures, Love and Adaptation, as well as a second work that's also set in Queensland, and I'm sure she'll be talking with you about this evening. So next to Jess, we have, just scrolling up my notes here, the lovely Claire Corbett. So Claire writes fiction and creative nonfiction. Her first novel, When We Have Wings, was published by Allen and Unwin, and it was shortlisted for the 2012 Barbara Jeffress Award. It was also shortlisted for the 2012 Ned Kelly Award for Best First Fiction, and it was also published overseas. Watch Over Me, her second novel, was published by Allen and Unwin in 2017, and she teaches creative writing at UTS, is deputy chair of the board of Varuna, the National Writers House, and she is fiction editor of Overland Literary Journal, among many other things and accomplishments. So this year, as well as this residency, Claire has also been awarded a Lockheed Fellowship by the University of Melbourne for her third novel, which she's been working on at the residency, called The Aquarium. So over to Jacques. Jacques Sarong is a multiple award-winning writer. He comes to us from Port Fairy, Victoria. He is a former lawyer, worked on the Bringing Them Home inquiry on native title, and with asylum seekers before trading his robes for writing pajamas. He's an avid surfer who began his career writing for Surfing World, where he began to tell stories that were less sports writing and more place writing. He's also interested in and writes about the themes of First Australians, mental health, forgotten histories, and place in the environment. He's written 5 novels, Quota, The Rules of Backyard Cricket, which I'm told is not really about sport. So even if you don't like sport like me, you should read it. It has some sport in it, okay. On the Java Ridge, which won the Colin Roderick Award in 2017, and the Bay Strait Historical Novels Preservation 2018, The Burning Island 2020, and The Settlement, which is due out in August. So Eliza Henry Jones is author and PhD candidate at Deakin University. She's published 4 or maybe 5 novels. 5th one's coming out. She's highly prolific. So her books have been shortlisted for awards such as the Readings Prize for New Australian Fiction, Queensland Literary Awards, and New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. Her articles, essays, and short fiction have been published widely, and her 5th novel, Salt and Skin, will also be coming out in August by Ultimo Press. She lives on a flower farm in the Yarra Valley in Wurundjeri country. And last but not least, Stacy Gogolis.
Least in terms of the bio, it's nice and short.
Not least. He is an illustrator, Triple J radio presenter, and comics maker living and working on the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Victoria. And his comics works have appeared across ABC platforms as well as in anthologies by Koos, which we learned today is a Latvian publisher, which is very prominent, and Fantagraphics. Thanks. So he is currently working on a debut graphic novel, kind of set on the reef / wilderness, which we will learn a little bit about today as well.
Sure.
Sure. Okay. So why don't we just start with you then? To
right
put you in
here.
a hot seat.
I got the mic.
I'm sure everybody
Try to
would
take it
love to hear what you've been working on. Would love to hear a little bit more about the world of graphic novels and what this residency meant for your work. Stacey.
Yeah, well, it's been amazing. The book that I'm working on, which is going to be out through Fantagraphics, which is a publisher in the US, at some point when I finish it, and not before. So it's a graphic novel. It's about a young woman who disappears into the bush, and we follow her over the course of the novel to find out exactly why she did. So while it's not set specifically on the reef, it does involve issues around climate change, and it's obviously set in a very wild situation, and it's been really interesting to kind of I've had to kind of go do a lot of like ABC-ing when it comes to I suppose taking all the information from the scientists and going, oh, that's super interesting, and then going a step further, being like, how can I transpose that onto what it is that I'm writing? And it's all very relevant, and it's been really great hearing. Particularly, people have been really generous, I think, with their personal stories as well, with the scientists, and because I was very interested in kind of how that, although the issues of climate change have affected them personally and deal. So yeah, I think that those personal connections that I've made has been the real pleasure. I'm sure everyone will talk about all the amazing science stuff that we got to see, but the community of AIMS has been really welcoming and everyone has a really interesting story and has been super generous with their time and their personal stories. I've appreciated that. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I know we'll circle back to you.
Great.
Because we've been doing a lot of circling back this week. But I wanted to circle all the way over to Jess, if that's okay, because I'm aware that maybe some of the people who are joining us either online or here or in Canada heard of a writing residency before. And I think this was probably your first one, Stacy.
My
Am I right?
first,
Was it
that's
your-
right.
was it your
My first book. That's
First book, first writing residency.
Yeah, in the shadow of
Yeah.
all of these illustrious, many published authors. It's a real pleasure
amazing,
to
aren't
pick
they?
their brains as well throughout the week.
So Jess, as we read your bio, you've been to writing residencies in Italy and all over the world. And I'd love to know, is this a pretty standard writing residency or a very unusual one? And I'd also love you to explain, if you might, to people who've never heard of what a writing residency is. Like, what is the purpose of it? What is it? Yeah.
Yeah, well, when you're an overworked academic and you have no time to write, a residency is a place where you can go and hang out with fabulous people. Not all of the time. You usually are meant to be writing for most of the day, and it gives you protected time to work on your manuscript without interruption from the demands of your job. So if you're someone with a really hectic life, it is a lifesaver in terms of finding time, continuous time to write your book. Because what often happens is that you get wrapped up in the world that you're writing about. So if you have all these intrusions, it breaks a train of thought and you can't continue with that world that you're creating. So in terms of how this residency compares to other ones that I've been on, I think it's the best residency I've ever been on. I said to these guys last night, this was the best week of my life. I think that says something about how I just haven't had time to write, and it was just delightful to be creative again and in such an incredible environment. The sea is gorgeous. I mean, the scientists were incredible. Wonderful companions. Linda looked after us so well. We were fed and put on several kilos. And we were looked after so well, we didn't have to stress about anything. We could just focus on our writing. And in the evening, we would gather and we would gossip about literary news and we would talk about craft. So it was magnificent. And I've had this book. I've been working on this book since 1998. That's when I first wrote the first section of it. And it was published in Southerly a few years later. And then I got an Australia Council grant and that ran out of money. And then I became an academic and I ran out of time. So I got to this residency and I was just like, when I saw the call out, I was like, I've wanted to do this for years. And when I got here, I worked out why I had wanted to do it for years, because there were problems in my story and I didn't know how to fix them without the scientists. So something was at the back of my head saying, you've got to go to tropical Queensland, you've got to go on this residency and you've got to talk to scientists. And so I got a big chunk of the book done. But the other thing that happened was that I had to completely rewrite the plot, because one of the plot devices is that it's about a remote coastal community, and a fellow who's had a relationship breakdown just wants to get away from everything. So he travels to this community and he falls in love with a woman there who's quite unusual. She keeps disappearing. She keeps swimming away at night. And he's a computer engineer. So he's like, I'm going to put a tracking device on her to see where she goes. A little bit creepy. And then I found out they can't track the people underwater. So now I've got to rewrite my book and come up with a new piece of technology. And then I was kind of really disappointed. And then I kept thinking about it. And I thought, well, I've got scientists who I can email. Sorry, there's going to be a few emails following up. And they can help me work out how to fix this narrative device that's causing problems. So for me, it was the most incredible week. Yeah. Thanks to everyone who put it together. And to you, Victoria, I'm very grateful.
We're so grateful. It's just been magic. Thanks, Jess. Claire's writing a novel called The Aquarium, and in her application, she said she thought this residency was made for her. So there were several themes that we asked writers who applied to address and to tell us how their work addressed it. One of those was, place-based narratives. Another was writing about the reef or about climate change. We talked about First Nations perspectives, for example. And all of these people are writing things that address most of those issues. And Claire's really stuck out to absolutely everybody on the selection committee, because she's like, oh, I'm writing a novel set in an aquarium. And it's about climate change. So I think this residency was made for me. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your work and how being at Ames is informing your thinking about it now.
Sure. If you don't mind, I'll just add a little bit to what Jess was saying about residencies, and then I'll absolutely address I just wanted to add that for people not writing perhaps novels in particular, it's quite specific to novels, although residencies are helpful to any kind of writing. But it could seem like a bit of an indulgence, like why can't you just take a holiday at home or whatever? But it's not like that. I could get more done in a week or two at a writing residency than in several years in normal life, because one of the main things, and I think especially for a lot of women writers, not having to shop and cook and have all those things in your head all the time, one of the biggest drivers of productivity is not having to think about that at all. And I was very aware that even though I'm on a little bit of a semester break from my university, it never stops, and there's bills to pay, and there's just life admin that goes on. And it's incalculable, the value of just having some protected time. And I just wanted to mention, I don't know if there's anyone here who hasn't written a novel. It seems like all the scientists that we've spoken to have all these amazing creative strings to their bows as well, which is fabulous. And of course, science itself is creative. But novels are very particularly demanding in that you are having to create this world, and you have to see it, and you have to live inside it. And when I'm in the later stages of writing a novel, it's like I can walk around in it. So I'm more in that world than I'm in this world. So that's sort of why that protected time is so important, and why you get so much more done. It's very difficult to do in bits and pieces and get to that immersive quality that you would like the reader to experience, where the reader can see it as well, if that makes sense. So yes, Victoria, when I saw the call out for this residency, I was like, that's got my name on it. That is so totally got my name on it. One thing I would say that's very different about this residency, and it's completely invaluable from my perspective, and I actually want to say something about that in a minute, is this residency has had much more input than most residencies. So most residencies are about output. You sort of go, and one of the main criteria that you get, or criterion, I should get my Latin plurals correct, that you get selected on for residencies, and I know because I was a main fellowship assessor for Varuna, is that you've got a work plan, that's credible. And I'm sure as scientists and engineers, you know all about that. That's like, here's my project, here's what I'm going to achieve with the money that you give me, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that's so special about this residency is because we've had a lot of input, I can now go away and sort of feed off that, like a camel with a hump or whatever, or a whale having fed down in the Antarctic for
or what are those drought master cows that we passed along the road?
Yeah. So, that can continue to feed what I'm doing for a long time. But as Jess said, you haven't heard the last of us. We have your emails. And in fact, I think, Eliza, you and I were talking about possibly doing a joint Zoom session so that, we're not bugging the same person multiple times, So my project grew out of a desire and I've been working on it for a while. I've always felt very connected to the ocean. I was born in Vancouver and then grew up in Sydney. And I wanted to say something about the oceans. That's ridiculous. That's not a sensible subject for a novel. It's too big. So I felt like I'd had a stroke of genius when I decided to set this book inside an aquarium with an attached research institute, which will not look anything like Ames, but will at least have some reality fed into it by some of the things that I've learned. And any of you who've studied creative writing will know that one of the first things you talk about with theory and creative writing is sort of Aristotelian ideas of unity of time and space. And I'm completely fascinated by novels that maybe take place over one dinner party or are just in one location. And so I thought, well, what a great idea to try and take thinking about ideas about what's happening with the oceans into this very personal space and into a very limited, very enclosed kind of, and pressurized, literally pressurized environment. And it's also thinking about, what does fiction do that nonfiction doesn't do? What's the difference? Like, why write a novel? And I've seen a lot of people in different spheres of expertise throw up their hands and decide to write fiction. So like I was following these two guys who were strategy experts in the US, and they knew everything about US military strategy and US military technology. And finally they just said, bugger it, we're not reaching people, we can write a novel, you know, and put it in a story, because story is the technology that we have where we can best organize and remember a lot of information, even though novels aren't primarily information, but it's about making it meaningful. And also, one way that maybe fiction writers are a little different, perhaps, to the traditional idea of what scientists do, is that we're sort of putting things together rather than breaking them down and analyzing them into tiny bits. So there's a place, I think, in our society, given that everything is so specialized now and you have to go so deep into areas of knowledge, that we still need people who can maybe take more of an overview and start to put it together and say, can we go on a sort of more emotional journey with this? Can I go on for a little bit more? Okay. Well, I just actually wanted to quote this. I don't normally bring a notebook to things like this, but I wanted to make sure I got the words right, rather than expect myself to remember it. And this came from a book that I'm reading at the moment called Fathoms. And this is one of the things that I think is so valuable about a residency like this. And I really hope it continues and that it can become part of even more collaboration between humanities, arts, and sciences. And this line from Fathoms by Rebecca Giggs, so I'm giving credit, not plagiarizing. She talks about the potential of a scientifically literate imagination. And I really love that because I don't think there's enough of that. Personally, for me, as a creative writer, reality inspires my imagination. And in fact, if all you have is imagination and there's no kind of reality there, it can actually just fall into cliches, tropes, and stereotypes. And people think they're being enormously imaginative and they're just recycling the same old things. And the other quote, which is relevant to that, is physicist Richard Feynman. And he says that nature's imagination is far wilder than that of humankind's. So this is one of the things I find so inspiring about doing a residency like this, is that my imagination can be inspired much more by learning about things like I never could have thought of myself.
That's awesome. I'm sure when you just said that each of us had an image of something wild that we learned this week about, like how cots multiply or something like that. You're like, what? Thank you. Jacques, you are a prolific and multiple award-winning writer who has, become very well known over the last decade in Australia. And I have to say, I'm sure everybody on this panel would agree, after hanging out with you for a week, you're one of the most humble writers that I've met. So I have a particular question for you, because I didn't hear you talking a lot this week. I saw you listening a lot this week. I have been reading about the great nature writer, Robert Macfarlane. He's somebody I love. But a critic of him says that one of the challenges of nature writing has been the charge that it reifies the divide between culture and nature, risking further alienation or even appropriation. So one critic of Macfarlane, for example, says this: "What's that coming over a hill? A white middle-class Englishman, a lone enraptured male from Cambridge, here to boldly go discovering, then quelling our harsh and lovely and sometimes difficult land with civilized lyrical words." So my question was, how do you avoid that? How do you avoid, reifying that binary between nature and culture, I suppose, or just imposing, your voice on things? And I'm asking you that question because I saw you listening a lot this week, and I'm guessing that might have something to do with it.
I feel like you've boxed me into a really dangerous corner here. I'm going to try and claw my way out of it.
Well, you're not. You're not from Cambridge. You're nothing like that, right?
Well, I think I would answer that differently as a reader, because I actually really enjoy those pompous Englishmen. It's kind of a corner of my reading that I love. And I think it's Macfarlane, who was literary executor for Roger Deakin, who was the guy who reinvigorated or maybe even invented the tradition of English wild swimming, where he was encouraging people to break into farms and jump in somebody's pond because the Druids did it in the 13th century or something. And the whole thing's so delightfully tweedy and wacky and English that I can't feel any ill will towards any of it, but I take your point more broadly. I'm trying to think my way back to a starting point. And Claire, you were talking about nature's wild imagination, that quote. I had the same thought when we went into the sea sim during the week. And I guess, you know, as an amateur, I would describe it as we were looking at an entirely artificial coral reef in a room. And a bit like when a human being submerges themselves with scuba gear, you're covered in stuff. You're covered in tanks and tubes and weights and all of these things in order to keep a clumsy human alive underwater. And when I looked at the sea sim coral room, I saw the same thing, which was that in order to replicate a thing that has this beautiful visual harmony at this system that's extraordinarily complex, you had to have a room with thousands of wires and tubes and tanks and heaters and lights and God knows what, filters and pumps. The complexity of us engaging with and imitating nature is just staggering. And that's been a real revelation to me this week, to see that done successfully. That's amazing in its own right. But also, once you create a human analogue, just how intricate that thing has to be to work. On residencies, this is also my first residency. I've never been on one. Yeah, barely leave home. And I work in a shed in the backyard. I'm sort of like a troll in a cave. I come out for food and that's about it. And when I was told that I was coming along to this, I remember the kids saying, "Oh, that's probably very good for you, Dad." That he was finally leaving the backyard. But it's you know, in terms of the priorities of all of our individual lives, it is a sacred little chunk of time in which to just roam around in your own head for a while without distractions, but then with stimulations, which is just a great combination. And working with scientists is such a joy and a privilege. Years ago, when I left the law, one of the things that was a bridge from the legal career to writing was that I was approached by these two mates to start a magazine. It's sort of somewhere between a journal and a magazine. It's a big hefty thing called Great Ocean Quarterly. And the kind of strapline of Great Ocean Quarterly was that it was art, ideas, and the sea. And we wanted to explore how people respond emotionally and creatively and artistically to the sea. So rather than it being necessarily a sailing magazine or a surfing magazine or a fishing magazine, it was a magazine about how the sea made people feel. And that we went broke a couple of times. One of the reasons we went broke was because newsagents would look at this thing and go, it's a fishing mag, and they'd put it in with the fishing mags, and that was the end of it. But one of the real joys of running Great Ocean Quarterly, I remember when we started, I thought, where on earth are we going to find writers? And the writers just came flooding to us. And more of them were scientists than were self-identified writers. People from universities and from agencies like AIMS, all over the country and indeed overseas, started sending in stuff. And what I learned, I left school like we all left school, being told that you were either analytical or you were creative, and that there were the arts and there were the sciences, and there's some kind of binary Rubicon in between. And here were all these scientists sending in their CVs and sending in their work and sending in their photographs and their art. And I suddenly had this just overwhelming sense that people who practice science and practice marine science are enormously keen to share the joys of it with other people. And that's been the same this week, that there's been a strong element of that, of the creativity of scientific people. And also, I might add, a pretty serious note of anger that we've seen. I think, is that fair comment? I don't mean that to sound at all pejorative, but that the people working at AIMS are at the front line of data that is under attack all of the time, in the media and in social media. And here's a group of people who actually have the numbers in front of them. And this is all part of a wider discussion about how expertise is under attack and how we live in an evidence-free society at the moment. Yeah, and maybe one of the things that we as writers share with scientists is that we're scratching away at deeper truths. And the work is a little bit timeless in that sense, in that you don't produce the truth tomorrow, You're digging away all of the time trying to find underlying truths and communicate them to people. And it's weird that making up stories for a living is in fact a search for truth a lot of the time. So that's been an interesting commonality to see between the two communities, I think.
And also, maybe just build the way that you build on people that have come before you as well, like the community, the idea of, you know, the science that is being done today couldn't have been done 10 years ago, in the same way that we build on literary traditions and stuff. It's just...
Yeah, I think that whole myth that there is a binary between science and arts was completely demolished for all of us this week. We just kept hearing commonalities after commonalities of, you know, circumstances of just being a scientist. And we're like, oh, that's like us too. We always kind of have this perception that, you know, on the other side of the fence, you know, that it's different or better. Eliza does amazing work in her critical analytical work for your PhD, but also, you know, creatively. She's amazingly prolific. But just feeding off of what Jacques has been talking about, because you've been talking about affect, really, I think, and how this has been affecting people. And this has been one of the amazing highlights of the residency was every lunch hour, we got the boardroom at Ames, and we got to go grab lunch, and a bunch of scientists would sit around the board table with us and just share stories and share information with us, and we just got to pick their brain, and it was amazing. But there was a common thread, as Jacques began to suggest, that emerged over the course of the week around how scientists are personally dealing with being at that cold face of climate change. And I just wondered, Eliza, if you wanted to talk about that, because I know you think a lot about affect in your work, and you think a lot about trauma in your work. How did that strike you this week? And how is that swirling around in your mind creatively? What are you thinking of doing with it? You can answer any bit of that question, or none at all.
It's a mess up there. So my background's actually in psychology and trauma counselling, and a lot of my work, both creative and critical, has really sort of circled around the intersection of place and trauma, and understanding how to make sense of that space. And I think the way I sort of think about creative writing is that it's less about finding an answer, and it's more about posing questions. And how do we navigate climate change? How do we understand the intersection of human and non-human? How do we conceptualize climate change when it's on such a broad scale? And I think what's been really striking is, like Jacques said, just the frustration and the passion and the resilience. And I think a lot of, from just skirting along the surface for a week, one of the things that really was apparent to me is that it sort of like comes down to a lack of, people are kind of distorting the data. People are twisting it to suit certain agendas. And I think one of the things that I am so grateful for this residency is being able to immerse myself in, the natural environment here, the research facility, being able to actually see the breadth of research being undertaken, but also to have the opportunity to glimpse the subtleties that are at play, and to be able to be part of the solution and help communicate what needs to be communicated in a different way. So I think that's really, really humbling. And I think that, having spoken to the other people in the residency at length, I think it's something that we're going to be working on for months, if not years into the future, just unpacking and unraveling and working out how we can help get those really vital messages out.
I think that's so well said. I mean, people seem to have this idea that science is just about data, and it is objective, and of course it is, and it's facts and all of those things, but we really saw the human face of that this week, and really connected with the human stories and the human toll behind that. And I don't think any of us can unsee that now that we've seen that.
It's such a gift, because normally, you know, if you're coming across scientific data or research, it's through a news article, it's through journal articles, it might, you know, if you're lucky, it might be through a lecture that you're able to attend or a Zoom session. But being able to actually sit down face to face with these people that just have such huge knowledge and passion about these really vital areas, it's amazing.
I should have said one of the writers who was on the residency and had to leave us early is Maria Takalander. Maria had to head back to Geelong to deal with a family situation, and she's writing a novel, a sort of post-apocalyptic novel. I kind of got like Cormac McCarthy, but feminist vibes from it, and it's like her and
That's
her
amazing.
son kind of thing that end up at the end of the world. And that, I guess, circling back, brings me back to thinking about the natural environment, because one of the things Maria said, as soon as you get into AIMS, and very few of us, except for people who work at AIMS or have worked at AIMS, have probably ever been on site because it's gated. But one of the things that you see as soon as you go through the gate is, first of all, this amazing pristine environment, peppered with this high-tech stuff, high-tech facilities. But it's so pristine because people haven't been allowed to go down there and just build squatter shacks or fish it. And of course, the scientists walk the beach, and Paul himself and his wife have been walking the beach and cleaning up the plastic. So it's pristine. But Maria said her first impression was, this place is like Jurassic Park. And we had a bit of a laugh about that. But I've been here in North Queensland now for 13 years, and it's hard for me to remember what this place first looked like to me when I arrived. But I am very aware it is a different natural environment than where most of you are, where all of you are from. So just wondering if we can kind of just reflect a little bit on your impressions of the there we go, can't talk. Natural environment. What did you expect, and what really struck you about the place?
What did I expect? I expected it to be more like it is today, the humid. We were so lucky for this whole week. Everyone was like, it's really cold, isn't it? It's really cold, like 24 degrees and sunny. It's beautiful. So it's been stunning all this week, and really trying to make the most of it and get out and see get up really early and see the sunrise, and walking on the beach every day. The environment is, the tropical plants, everything's kind of bigger, except for the wallabies, they're small. There was a frog in the toilet last night. These sorts of things that you don't get in the city, the big smoke. But the natural environment, I think, I think the nicest moment was when we all went around to the jetty and we saw the turtles and an unknowable, mysterious, huge
Crocoturtle.
And so brushing up against that, and also with the animals at the CSIM and throughout, we got to get a lot closer, just getting a lot closer than we normally do. And of course, for me, being from living in Melbourne and being locked down for the last couple of years, to get out and be so close to the wild has been really good.
Australian wildlife is everywhere.
Australian wildlife is everywhere.
We're laughing at the signage at AIMS. Inside joke, sorry.
And I think just to add to that, the value of all the tiny little details that you're just not going to think of without actually physically being in a place. And I think that's what really lends resonance to creative work, whether that's fiction or non-fiction. It's just it just lends so much. So that's been really, really valuable.
Thank you. my favourite animal experience was on the first night that we were here. Stacy and I We are either side of a very, very thin wall in the accommodation. And in the middle of the night, I was woken up by this extraordinary kerfuffle. Stacey, can you make the noise?
Thank you, everyone. Yes, it was something like.
So if you can imagine, I've been woken in the middle of the night and the brain's only working at about 30%. And I'm hearing this noise and then the running around and opening and shutting of doors. So what I imagined was that Stacey is having some sort of respiratory crisis. And he's actually, I could picture him staggering across his room trying to get help and sort of flailing hands.
Interesting that you mentioned say this because you never checked on me.
Well, this is the thing. This is the thing. Then I went through a crisis of conscience about, do I intervene? And how strange is it going to be if I knock on his door at this hour? It's about 3 o'clock in the morning. And so in the end, I'm sorry to say that either sleep or just apathy got in the way. And I
Left him to his fate.
sleep. And the next morning, very early, I saw Stacey out walking. I said, mate, are you okay? And he just looked at me blankly and said, why? and then you can perhaps take it from there. We think it was a pig.
Well, no, we had both gotten up at the same thing. Although I thought it was an animal, which it was, and I was trying to, I couldn't get a glimpse of it though, and I kept going, running to the front door, like looking out, like where is that? What is that? Something, and then go and like so it would stop, and then I'd go back to bed, and then it would happen again. But yeah, talked to some scientists, and I thought it was like maybe wild pig. They thought possum. Could be anything.
With big, scary
The
boar,
largest
wild
possum
boar,
you'd
big
ever-
tusks.
Yeah.
Environment. Anyone else want to share?
So I've spent a bit of time in far north Queensland. My stepfather lives in Cooktown, and so I've sort of gone up and spent time in Cooktown and then sort of come back down through the Daintree and kind of gone out to the reef from Cairns. But I guess what I'd like to say is something about reaffirming the importance of the specificity of place, and that's something that's so beautifully embodied and articulated and discussed through like Welcome to Country by Eddie Smallwood, and then actually getting to hear from him and having that fantastically articulate and precise weaving through of things to do with his life and his work. And there was something that, I'm sorry, her name has escaped me, but the person at AIMS who was doing like Indigenous partnerships, Libby, yeah, that's right. And she said something that really struck me, and that was, and I hadn't thought of it that way before, and then it really hit me hard. And she was saying like, it's all very well for someone in her position to, negotiate issues with Indigenous elders and community, but for them, if they feel like they've made a mistake or people don't agree or something goes wrong, like that's no walking away from that. You never, the consequences are enormous and could reverberate over such long periods of time. And that really sunk home to me. And I feel like through issues of hopefully learning more about Indigenous culture, that we talk about Australia, but this is a continent. Like every region of it is so different. And we don't even have the seasons right. We impose these European ideas of seasons onto parts of the country where there's 6 seasons, or there's 2, or there's, and so even after several centuries, we're not even at the starting block of that specific knowledge of country. So I feel like, again, going back to buttering up how important the residency is, that after several...
Didn't pay them to say this.
No. But after several years of being in lockdown, teaching online, to reassert the importance of coming to a specific place with specific knowledge, both Indigenous and scientific, it feels really powerful and really important. And I'll just say one more quick thing about that, which is that I've noticed, maybe because people are spending a lot of time on screens, and this was happening before the pandemic, but a lot of creative writing students I'm finding are sort of writing out of no place. There's often no sense of a physical lived environment in their writing. So going back to what Eliza was saying, that idea of us being able to kind of inhabit a very specific place with imagery, including like of the labs and CSIM, it's really powerful.
I think we'll do some circling back. I don't have an animal story. I'm quite deaf. I can only hear out of this ear, so I concentrate very hard to read, and I use tech. So I sleep very soundly. So nothing woke me up. Was a little bit nervous about the crocodiles. But what struck me most, and this goes back to the lunchtime conversations, and was the first conversation that Paul had with us. He basically, and he and other scientists said, we've got 10 years. Well, we don't have 10 years. We've got to do something now about climate change because all the pollution the last couple of decades is built in. So when I heard that, I had a bit of a heart attack. And I was like, and I'm going to finish this book because I'm just so desperate to get the story out, to get the science out, to get the information out, and to educate people that all this incredible wildlife, the incredible coral, the symbiosis that makes the coral beautiful is going to be gone unless we do something about it. By 2075, if we can continue on the current trajectory, we won't have a reef. So this sense of time and urgency and sheer panic was what struck me most, I think, from talking to the scientists. And the fact that we're enjoying this, we've got this amazing place, but what about the future generations? What are they going to have? So yeah, I was really panicked when I heard that and motivated to do something about it. Yeah.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, of course.
I want to give a shout out to the engineers. We keep talking about scientists, but Paul's background is an engineer, and there's another engineer in the audience, and those conversations were also fabulous. So shout out to the engineers as well as the scientists.
I feel like it's probably time for us to throw open the questions. So thank you all for answering the questions I posed, but I'm sure other people who weren't on the residency have lots of questions as well. So I'll hand it to you, John, to facilitate. Thanks.
Jock, can I ask a question? You mentioned the magazine, which was great, and you mentioned it in your application as well. And one of the things that you were talking about was that difference between the Great Southern Ocean, freezing cold, and coming up here and experience the tropics for the first time. How did that pan out?
Well, I had been doing some reading and writing about a relatively new concept called the Great Southern Reef, which is the notion that all of the cool temperate reefs from about Shark Bay in the west, around the bottom of the continent to about Coolangatta in the east, are in fact one unified biological system, and that you can compare the scientific effort and the funding and the cultural knowledge of the Great Barrier Reef with this idea of a Great Southern Reef, which is in fact where most of Australia's population is concentrated. So I've been really interested in that idea as an inverse of the tropics, and I know nothing at all about the tropics. I've spent so little time up here in this part of Australia. So that comparison is really interesting to me. And it's funny, making contact with home, that people are absolutely freezing and how quickly you forget when you're here because it's just so lovely and comfortable. So yeah, I've spent a lifetime in cool temperate waters, and most of what I think of as the ecology around me in the water is based around kelp, which I guess is the equivalent substrate for what happens up here. So yeah, the differences are really interesting.
So I've got another, so we're online as well. So we've got some questions coming through, and with high technology, I'm getting pictures from Erin and reading them out to you. So it's a general question too. There are probably a lot of people interested in, and quite a few of you mentioned it, but how has COVID affect your writing? Now, I know you spoke to that earlier about the fact that people have been locked up and maybe not be able to connect to place, but how have you felt coming out of COVID and actually going to a residency?
So for those of us that are down in Metro Melbourne, we were in lockdown for quite a while, and I'm on a little farm, which is really lovely, and lockdown was a huge struggle in a lot of ways, but it also gave me the opportunity to go quite deeply into a very specific place. I am so familiar now with all of the things going on my farm, like the way the light falls across the land, the different textures of the soil at different times of year, the names of the different eucalypts that are growing. And there's, such power in that, and I absolutely love having that knowledge. But conversely, it has just been so wild and amazing to just, because this is the first, big trip I've done since 2019. So to actually be in another place and to suddenly be acutely aware of the different types of trees and shrubs and soils and stones and the humidity, like everything, it's just, it's been really great. And being back out around people, I'm kind of like Jock. I just kind of like hermit down on my little farm and don't go out very much. So it's been really lovely to interact with the human race.
Like going back to what you guys were saying before about, I guess, I think Claire, you were talking about taking things in, and that's been a big part of what we've been doing this week. But I felt like for me, COVID, I was, spent a lot of time locked down in Melbourne, but it was a really like productive period for me because I was very lucky. I had regular work and stuff, so I was fine in other ways. So I was able to use all this extra time that I would normally be seeing my friends or doing stuff too. And that's when I wrote the pitch for my book and sent it out and really did a lot more writing work than I'd ever done before. But what I didn't have was any input to work from. So it was like you reach a wall with that, and that's what this is opened up, opened up the world and experience together, and then you can go away and sprout like a coral.
I would have to, I'll say one negative thing and one positive thing. COVID's been a disaster for productivity for many of us, and it certainly was for me. I lost almost all my colleagues. So just hundreds of years of experience ripped out of my discipline and profession because of the lack of support for universities. So in that sense, like nothing creative got done. We were just scrambling to try and save a little bit of the furniture. And we transitioned to online teaching in 1 week, having never done it before. But on the positive note, what I feel about this residency in particular, like specifically, not just any residency, is that I really love this idea that maybe we can forge more of a partnership. And I know we keep saying that, science is an art, but it can be done. There can be a lot more of that. And just very quickly, I would say we didn't used to have this big divide. I've never thought there was a divide, ever. Because if you think about things like the role of drawing in the development of science, like it's about observation, it's about precision. These are ways of knowing the world. And there didn't used to be any distinction in writing either. So just very briefly, Johannes Kepler, who, developed and wrote about the laws of planetary motion. He did that in a fairy tale. His first publication of the laws of planetary motion was in a fairy tale about a witch who goes to the moon with her son. So that distinction wasn't made. And here's a really cute one. Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, wrote a 2-volume book of poetry that was erotic poetry based on Linnaeus's taxonomy of plants called The Loves of the Plants, and it was a bestseller. And was reprinted many times.
Right. I'll ask another question because I think you covered that pretty well. The panelists work in a variety of forms, including poetry, fiction, non-fiction, and also illustration. What are some of the challenges that you each face depicting the human experience of the natural world? That's from Roger in Cairns.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so what are some of the challenges you face in depicting the human experience of the natural world?
In the genre that you work in?
Yeah, I'm just trying to gather my thoughts, which are quite scattered after this very intense week. We were talking earlier about, Kathleen Jamie's critique of the lone white man in the wilderness. And I think part of Kathleen Jamie's critique is that idea is a fallacy, because what she's talking about in that critique is that when Robert Macfarlane's out walking, he doesn't include his conversations with anyone else on his walks, but he is actually connected to a living world, and that world is keeping him alive. So even though we're not always conscious of nature, nature is all around us. Nature is the air that we're breathing. Nature is the trees out there. Nature is in the cities. So this divide between human and nature is completely fictional. So the work that I was doing before I realised I had a novel that I could finish in the next couple of months is an eco-biography of a botanist from 19th century Western Australia, Georgiana Malloy. And I'm writing an eco-biography. A biography is of a person, but an eco-biography is of how an environment shapes that person's sense of self. Everyone can write an eco-biography because nature's always influencing who we are. And I was trying to argue that the plants dramatically shaped Georgiana Malloy's life. And then I had to turn from soil to water. And I am writing about, I've got two strands. The other strand is about the mermaid that lives forever. And the mermaid is a metaphor for the Great Barrier Reef. And what I'm trying to do is use a human, like a metaphor of something that we can identify with, to talk about what's happening to the reef. So the mermaid's body disintegrates, which is what is happening to the reef. So that's my answer to that question. I'm using a very human-centered metaphor as a way of communicating what we're losing, basically.
Right. I've got another one online from Bianca, and she just says, all panelists, any advice for future applicants for this residency? How can I make my application stand out and be more competitive? Been a great session. It was interesting because as assessors, it's really interesting to see how people apply for things like this. And it's, from an assessor's point of view, you just want it plain and you want it really straightforward about what you're wanting to do and how you want to do it. But what was your experience and what feedback can you give other people who are applying for residencies? And some of you have been on a few.
I think Claire is probably very well primed to answer this, not to put you on the spot, but because Claire is on the board of Varuna, and Varuna is in the Blue Mountains. It was the former house of the writer Eleanor Dark and her husband Eric Dark, and their son Mick Dark bequeathed it to writers of Australia. And it was my time at Varuna that actually kind of planted the seed of this idea that then translated to a conversation with Paul, who was like, yeah, let's do that. But Claire is familiar with assessing applications. So I guess that's why I'm putting you on the spot, because we've already had a bit of this conversation. I said to her, you've seen a lot of applications over the years. Have you become really good at writing them because of that? And she had an interesting answer.
Sorry, what was it?
Yeah, okay. Well, you said that you felt that a number of people who apply kind of overlook how does what you propose to do connect with the remit of this residency? Yeah.
So my first comment is that you and John and the other assessors may be better placed to answer that question than I am. But I will say that before I became a board member, I was an assessor on the main fellowship program for Varuna for 3 years. And it was extremely intense because we get normally between 200 and 400 applications for the main fellowship program, and we read 50 pages of each application, and which is more than most residencies and things like that only give you 10 pages, and it's across all genres: poetry, non-fiction, screenwriting, fiction. And so I could say with honesty, putting that together with my role on Overland, that I have a very broad and deep overview of kind of all the writing that's being done in Australia. But I would slightly contradict you only in that it's partly a numbers game to answer the question. Like, I'm not, I don't just write an application and magically get the residency. In that sense, like, I knew this one was made for me. So yeah, the advice of what I was talking about with Victoria was that it's very easy to see that a lot of writers are like, here's my sample of great writing, but then they don't work hard enough on the other questions about, well, why this residency? Why will this benefit? And if you think about it, like, you've got this very diverse range of writing, and you're sort of thinking, okay, what's making it stand out? And also, we've only got a few places. We need it to go to people that will get the most benefit out of it and will bring the most benefit back to the institution that supported the residency in the first place. So there's a sense of that fertility. So what I would also say then is that grant writing applications, and many of you would know this, and also residency writing applications is a whole skill in itself and needs to be practiced, but it has to be taken seriously. Like when I applied for the job of fiction editor of Overland, I got to see the other applications later on, and they didn't even address the criteria. They were just like, well, I'm going to do a better job than the current editor. And not surprisingly, they didn't get it. So, whereas my application was like, here are the recent stories in Overland that I thought were really good, showing that I'd read the magazine.
Can I add one little thing there, John, that I think it probably helps. I don't know what I did write in the application, incidentally, so I'm guessing. Yeah. But I think it helps if you climb out of your own head and try to think about the organisation and what it's trying to do. So I remember when I did that application, I was thinking about, okay, who are AIMS and what do they do and what's important about this moment being the 50th anniversary and therefore what might be the things about me that are useful to that mission. Because it's all of us, it's the same as applying for a job. You get very focused on what attributes have I got to offer here and who am I and what are the things that I can try and impress with. But if you flip it on its head and say, what are these people trying to achieve? I think that can really help.
Yep, that's great. Roger's got another one. Do you ever consider the natural world as a character rather than a setting? If so, what techniques would you use to do that?
I don't actually have an answer for this, but that's something I've been grappling with for the last 3 years. How to do justice to the environment when narrative and language is so inherently skewed towards the human. And I think that, you know, in a lot of writing, the environment and place is just a backdrop and it isn't multifaceted and it doesn't have complexity to it. So I think just taking the time to consider landscape and environment as something worthy of complexity and worthy of dynamicism is such a vital way to start. I don't know whether other people have more articulate things to add.
I have a very short answer, which is that the best example of that, of the natural world as character, that I've read recently in Australian fiction was Andrew McGahan's final novel called The Rich Man's House. It's about 3 years old now, 4 years old, and he's a Queenslander. Beautiful. It's an imaginary mountain in the Southern Ocean, which becomes very, very angry at human interference and sets about knocking off the people who have interfered. But yeah, as an exercise in exactly that, it's a great book to read.
Yeah.
Jeff.
I think a lot of First Nations people's writing represents that really well. If you look at Alexis Wright's Carpentaria, the cyclone is a major character in that book. And I think a lot of what, conventional like writing that stems from the Western way of thinking is that we seek to control it, but nature is uncontrollable. And so whenever we try to control something, it's just a fiction, basically. But I think First Nations writers are very aware of the power of country, and it comes up through the writing, comes up through the words, and manifests as a presence in the book.
I think it's often portrayed as either being very benign or very hostile in other, and there's not a lot of work that inhabits that middle ground.
I think the other thing that really impressed upon a lot of us this week at AIMS too, especially after having met and had an amazing smoking ceremony with Eddie Smallwood, traditional Bindle elder, is the way in which landscape has memory, not just history, and that when you're there, you can feel it. And, you know, some of us were talking about James Morrell and the James Morrell Cave at AIMS, and some of us may have gone inside of it. Shh, don't tell Paul. But I think I have a different sense of historical fiction after having dwelled in a really important site. For those of you who don't know the James Morrell story, he was, you know, the first white man in North Queensland who was washed ashore, shipwrecked at Cape Cleveland after 42 days in a raft at sea, and then survived in the cave there that's now at Ames until he was rescued by Indigenous people, the Bindal people. And he lived with them for 17 years before he was then, well, I think he gave himself up, really. David Malouf has written about this, gave himself up to white men when he saw that the pastoralists were encroaching upon the North Queensland land, to advocate for land rights for the Indigenous people in the 1860s. And he died 2 years after he was after he reintegrated with white society. And some of us said, well, gee, that sure says something for white society. But they, for the 50th anniversary, I don't know if I'm allowed to announce this. Ames people, am I allowed to say what you're doing for the 50th anniversary about naming? Okay. Well, they're doing something really spectacular around naming. And Eddie Smallwood was telling us they're naming it the Bindal word. So we on the James Cook University campus have Aboriginal names for our campuses, and they're going to give an Aboriginal name to the Ames campus. And the name is the Bindal word for shooting star, because when they discovered, when the Aboriginal people discovered James Morrell in the cave, they were following a shooting star, which was probably, they think, a flare, or it might have been, you know, it might have been something cosmological. And it was so resonant. Eddie Smallwood said that shooting star was really important because in their lore, it meant that there was an enemy coming or somebody who needed to be rescued. And we just sort of looked at each other and we're like, wow, that's so resonant. Just to feel that place, to me, is a long answer to landscape being a character. It feels like it has a memory that you can connect with, that's still alive. It's not other.
No, and yeah, I think going back again to something that was said earlier about humans not being separate from the landscape, to think of them as separate from country, from nature itself. We like to think that we are, but we are not. And something that I've been thinking about a lot this week, and I don't know yet how it's going to get into the writing, but is I've been reading a lot about mushrooms as well, and thinking about humans not as, it's really kind of interesting to see the breakdown of the individual, thinking of humans not as bodies, not as individuals as ourselves, but as more an ecosystem where other things live, and a process. Think of the person, think of everything as a process rather than a thing that exists, because it doesn't. So yeah, and that's because my art is also very visual. It's merging pictures with writing. I'm looking forward to getting stuck into that and coming up with some gnarly images.
So Paul's actually written a question, text me through before he's actually on a plane and he can't.
He made his plane.
Yeah, so he made his plane. But the question he wants to ask you all is, why do you write?
I can start.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, okay. Well, for me, it's related to being deaf. So when I was young, I didn't have enough hearing to work out how to have a conversation with someone. So I just read books all the time, and I'd write letters to people because that was my form of communication. And a careers advisor suggested to me, why don't you try creative writing? And to their credit, my parents said, okay. They didn't know what I could do with that degree. But when I went to university and I started writing, I was like, this is exactly what I want to do. And for me, writing is a way of processing the frustration and anxiety of being out of place as a deaf person in a hearing world. And over the years, it's become something integral to my being, which I think most of us here would feel like. It's like breathing to me. I can't think unless I'm writing. I can't process things unless I'm writing. So for me, it's just an unquestionable way of being.
Thank you, Paul. What a great question. I haven't known myself apart from writing. So I got my first piece of writing published, a very short poem, when I was 4, but only because my mother was doing an MA in English at UBC. And it was like the children of the staff got things published. But I can tell you that all the themes in that 4-line poem are still the themes that I'm working with today. Yeah, it was something about a rainbow appearing in the sky and all the people saw the rainbow. And so to me, that's about awe and wonder at the natural world and then this human relation to it. So for me, I had a lot of amazing things in my childhood, but also a lot of difficult things. And so for me, writing is a way of being able to experience anything that I can imagine. And we know from the neuroscience that it's really been proven that the human brain, which exists in darkness and silence in our skulls and can only interpret the world through electrical signals, doesn't make a huge distinction between experiences we have from reading and experiences that we have in other ways. So for me, reading and writing is like this limitless power to experience worlds and lives.
Oh, you can't just hand me a microphone after you said that. That was extraordinary. Maybe some simple version of the same thing, which I think is that I've always been an avid reader, and I think I came to the idea that we take all of this stuff in all of our lives, and that you can either just keep taking it in and then die one day and it dies with you. The particular assemblage of things that each of us have absorbed through reading, which is completely unique to each of us, that either you take it on board and then it gets buried, or you try to give it back and contribute in some way so that it becomes part of an ongoing conversation between people. Yeah, and that, and I love the experience of writing. I love to be lost in a world for a period of time, and the way that time itself behaves a little oddly when you are writing, that you get lost in that moment of concentration or that flow state, which lots of people get from lots of different experiences, to be fair, but my particular one would be writing, I suppose.
I think I'm quite similar to Claire in that, amazing things happened in my childhood, but also had challenges. And for me, writing was just what I gravitated towards not even to understand, but to just get some clarity around what I was grappling with, to formulate questions about the world and my own experiences and wider truth and how that sort of fits together. And it's almost like a compulsion. I can't not write. I get really antsy if I don't have a novel or two on the go. Like it's like you hear runners talking about how they have to run, like they need that hit of, what is it, like, I don't run, like, is it endorphins, the good, happy feel good? Yeah, endorphins. That's like blisters. That's what I need to write for the same reason. I don't function unless I'm writing. And I think the big thing that I've learned over the course of publishing 4, and the 5th one is now in print, so I'm going to count it. Going 5, has been the thing for me. It's about preserving and cultivating joy in the process, and it's such a integral part of who I am, and I'm very grateful to be able to do it as much as I do.
Oh, okay. Writing sucks and I don't like it. And no one will tell you it's hard. It sucks. I love that these people find so much joy in it. I love having ideas, and I love the satisfaction of a finished product, and everything in between is hard and I want to give up all the time. And I start things, and I think at 100 stages across the way, why am I doing this? And I've come quite late to writing. I'm come more from a visual background, and so I think I have maybe more insecurities and imposter syndrome than most. But just what I would say is it's you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, as I believe someone said. Wayne Gretzky said that, the famous ice hockey player, if you didn't know.
Yeah. Okay, one more question up here. And for those online, no, it's all right, because then they can hear you as well. But for those online, we've had a bit of a problem getting your questions, but if you do want to send them through now, we will follow up with the authors later, if that's okay.
Can I just ask what you predict will be the most direct impact from your writer's residency at Ames on your writing when you go back to your own specific locations?
Oh, can I just repeat that? The question, Kay, was what is, in your estimation, the most direct impact from the writer's residency on their writing when they go away? Okay, thanks.
Well, oddly indirect for me. I am writing a novel that is unrelated to the sea, and I had got hopelessly stuck. And I think a lot of writers of novels do a lot of freelancing because you've got to keep some income coming in, and novels are slow-moving beasts. So a lot of my time gets taken up chasing other jobs around, and it means that when you get stuck in a novel manuscript, you tend to shelve the thing while you sort out the more pressing problems. So I had been stuck for some time, and being here in a bit of clear air, it seems to have unstuck itself. There's a cork out of the bottle effect going on. So that's what my lasting legacy from here will be.
I'm going to use a super cheesy metaphor, which is a metaphor that I've used before. It's not actually inspired by Ames. But for me, the imagination is a little bit like trying to provide a bit of superstructure for a coral reef. It's like, you need something for it to grow on, and then you might not. And I've actually seen, like in different parts of the world, this sort of ugly metal bars that are electrified or whatever for coral to grow on. And then if you get the nice reef on top, you don't even see whatever the thing is providing the structure. And so for me, this residency is a bit like that, in that there's this sort of injection of ideas and reality that I didn't necessarily know with that level of precision. And so it's like things will then flower on top of that and grow in different ways.
Yeah, my response is similar, especially to Jacques. I was just stuck, like this thing was languishing in a drawer on my computer. And I've had time for the ideas to unfold, and the science that I learned was critical to that. Like I said, the tracking device, but also the second half of the book was just like this morass, this wasteland. And now I've started populating it. And one of the characters that was just an appendage and not doing anything now has work to do in that book. So that was really valuable. I also I co-edit a magazine of creative writing and art inspired by science called Science Right Now. And I'm desperately hoping that we can run an issue to do with marine science and biology. Yeah. And then my co-editor is Amanda Niehaus. She's a biologist and she's very switched on about these things too. Yeah. Oh, that'd be fantastic. Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, we're just about to wind up. Anybody else want to make a last comment? Okay, well, I'm going to have a few thank yous. Firstly, to you for applying and for coming up and giving so much to the 50th anniversary of Ames, because it was a very special event. Ames do have the odd open day, but the rest of the community is a bit like you. We're gated out and we don't get to see inside very often. So thanks for coming up and sharing that with Ames and their 50th anniversary. Thanks to Victoria for looking after our guests while she was down there. It was good to be able to have someone on the ground there, so that's great. Marge Naylor is our coordinator and secretariat for the foundation, and all this wouldn't happen without Marge doing lots of work behind the scenes. And you probably know that more than anybody. So thanks, Marge, for all your work that you do. Thanks to Linda very much for your on-the-ground support at Ames. It wouldn't have happened without you as well, so great. Thank you very much. And of course to Ames staff and Paul and the board who all tick this off, because it's not an easy thing to get past the board and say, yes, we're going to do this. But the board were 100% behind it. Paul was 100% behind it, and so were the staff. And so it really worked well because of that. So the experience was there because we had 100% support. Social media, thanks, Bethany. And to the rest of the board, Roger included up in Cairns, who went through this process as well and said, yep, let's tick it off, and this is a great idea. Even if it's a one-off, we'd like to probably look at this, but even if it's a one-off, it's worked very well. To the virtual Zoom people, thank you very much. There was actually 91 of you out there, so I hope you stayed with us for the whole time. It really made the event as well. Send your questions in and we'll capture them and get back to you as soon as we can. And Erin, you can't see Erin, but she's behind the wall there and she's doing all the backroom jobs. So thank you, Erin.
Can I do a little shout out to Kerry and the crew as well at the cafe? Because they were so great and they kept us, all week, left us all this food for the weekend, did so much extra work, and they were amazing. And Eduardo, who hosted us for dinner, and the paella. And shout outs to Maria as well, if you're still watching, because she was going to join the Zoom, I think. And she was great.
That's great, Stace. Thanks. I hope I didn't miss anybody.
I just wanted to say thank you for all of you being here physically, because it's awesome to have people online, but to see you smiling and nodding and everything really made it so much, more powerful to do. So thank you.
All right.